Okay, everyone. So just to remind you, the big four that you see in the photograph in the slideshow here, this really represents some of the leaders of the Paris Peace Conference. Of course, there's many others. We know Japan had some significant power, but there's more than 25 countries present, but we do see the big four really with the competing agendas and a great deal of need to compromise. France, of course, is going to be most fearful that there's going to be some sort of future threat from Germany and really wants to destabilize Germany as much as possible and also access compensation for losses in the war. The British are going to somewhat sympathize with the French needs, but at the same time are going to be a little bit more interested in a stable Germany for a more clear sense of balance of power in Europe. There is some interest in Britain committing to its imperial colonies, but at the same time, there is going to be some interest and sympathy with the 14 points as well. So Britain is kind of placing itself in a few different areas when it comes to the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson, of course, is going to be adamant about the League of Nations and will compromise on some of the other areas of the 14 points. The Vittoria Orlando from Italy is very much kind of connected to an earlier Treaty of London, which had promised in return for Italy's role in the Allied powers that Italy would gain land acquisitions. And that's something that is most important to Italy. Italy sees its losses as significant and really wants to walk away from the war, having made the war effort, worth it. Of course, these are just some of the big emphasis, so you can kind of get a sense of what some of the goals are and how their agendas are going to frame some of the outcomes of the Treaty of Versailles. And just to remind you, this Paris Peace Conference will see a series of different treaties. The Allies will have separate treaties for Austria, for Hungary, for the Ottoman Empire, and ultimately Bulgaria, and Germany. And so these various peace treaties end up being distinct, and oftentimes it's the Treaty of Versailles that gets the most focus. The other treaties are also really significant. So we do see Wilson really promoting the 14 points. Just to remind you of the big takeaways from the 14 points, we looked at this in class. The first 5 of the sections are really about, eliminating the causes of World War I, calling for an end to secret treaties, calling for freedom of the seas, eliminating, some of these imperial colonies in the future. So trying to kind of reverse some of the outcomes of what caused World War I, create maybe global cooperation. The second section of the 14 points is really focused on the idea of self-determination and changing national boundaries. And this is where we see, cartographers and, planners and politicians and people meeting to actually redraw the map of Europe, revolving around some of the promises to groups of people. And of course, this mood of self-determination is going to create a lot of independence movements amongst people of the world who see the principles that Wilson is kind of anti-imperialist, and ultimately, so was Lenin, and we get this kind of anti-imperialist and in some cases even like Marxist framework for countries of the world to kind of seek greater independence. And then, of course, the very last component of the 14 points, which is going to be most significant to Wilson, is the League of Nations, which creates this opportunity, even with flaws in the Treaty of Versailles or other treaties. The League of Nations is created with this idea that countries of the world, have a space for diplomacy. And that's essentially what it is. The League of Nations is, kind of this hopeful space for a great deal of negotiations. It will become not as ideal as Wilson had hoped. Ultimately, Russia and Germany are denied the privilege of being in the League of Nations until later in time, and the United States, which never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles and ultimately will never be a member in the League of Nations, is also going to limit some of the power of the League of Nations. So Britain and France, of course, are going to disagree with many of the components of the Treaty of Versailles, and Wilson is going to be forced to compromise at great, cost, in a sense, to the 14 points. and the Treaty of Versailles is the outgrowth of this. So let's look at some of the provisions of the treaty. In some ways that the treaty was a compromise. You are going to see new countries. So we'll look at some of this. Poland, for example, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, countries that were not on the map in 1914 get created. And this is an outgrowth of self-determination. And this is also, we see this land coming from the former land that either Germany or Austria-Hungary had held. But we also see Germany's colonies, right? So some of the land that Germany held will go to a variety of victors, including Japan. Germany will also have to accept the war guilt clause. So this has a lot of psychological effect in Germany. There's a lot of suggestions that Germany was not really the sole cause of the war, that there were a series of events that lent itself to the cause of the war, but the war guilt clause serves as like justification for the reparations that are going to be something like to the tune of $33 billion. That amount is not set up in the Treaty of Versailles. The reparations concept is, and then the amount is served at a later date. This is of such great controversy even during the conference. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, ultimately kind of leaves the conference and backs out of being involved in it because he is, horrified by some of the issues of the reparations, what it will do to the global economy. There's no mention in the treaty of some of the earlier part of the 14 points, free trade and freedom of the seas. And the Treaty of Versailles in and of itself is largely drafted in secret and embodies what becomes mandates to some of the British and the French. And some of these are the result of backroom treaties that had happened during the time of the war, such as the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which is a treaty that had been between France and Britain, and ultimately Russia too, but they back out of it eventually. But the British and French are going to decide to split up some of the land of the Ottoman Empire. Before the Ottoman Empire even collapsed, there's interest that Britain and France had in places like Syria and Iraq, and ultimately there is a discussion of British and French control. Those secret treaties get embedded into the Treaty of Versailles, and those treaties are also announced by the Bolsheviks that these were secret treaties. So kind of creates a lot of resentment and issues related to how much are the 14 points being upheld in the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson, of course, had hoped for what he called peace without victory, this idea that the United States wasn't going to walk away with land or with, money or any of those things, but, that the purpose of the treaty was essentially future world peace, that, this would be the war to end all wars. That doesn't necessarily happen because the Treaty of Versailles is just going to create some new problems. And there's just a great deal of ethnic tensions. When the map gets redrawn, there's just a great deal of new tensions that get created. But to remind you of some of the really big takeaways, if we look at the map, first of all, this is in 1914. So note the size of Germany and how extensive it is. Germany, of course, is a central power. Austria-Hungary is a central power. So is Bulgaria, and so is the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire had seen some of its land even falling prior to World War I in the Balkan Wars. So there's kind of been already increases in some land for countries, for example, like Serbia. But in any case, the Russian leaving of the war and signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk will actually extend Germany's land even more so. So before the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's incredibly sizable, has acquired a great deal of land from Russia, and ultimately will see some of that land and part of the former, kind of position of Germany, look for land being taken from Germany on both the west and the east portions. We know that there was bitterness over the 1871 Prussian and French War. So Alsace and Lorraine, which is kind of this area between France and Germany in 1914, part of Germany, but will ultimately go back to France. We also can note, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, and this very, very large Austria-Hungary. What happens when the Treaty of Versailles takes place? Some of the land that was part of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and went from Russia to Germany now will become the independent states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. You'll also see the new country of Poland carved out of Germany and some of the land from the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. We also see in the time period right after the Treaty of Versailles, the Soviet Union established after a long civil war between Bolsheviks and White Russians. There's also going to be the country of Czechoslovakia, okay, so taking up a lot of the land in the former German area, so Germany, and then also Austria-Hungary. We see Austria and Hungary much smaller than before. The treaty that will serve this, to this day, very big issues in both Austria and in Hungary. The Treaty of Trianon in Hungary, for example, and then the country of Yugoslavia, which is going to create a great deal of territory for what becomes like a pan-Slavic state. So we see no more Serbia on the map, but we see Yugoslavia, and we see lots of Slavic peoples in this new country of Yugoslavia. So there's quite a few changes that are really significant. You can see the territory of France has increased by Alsace and Lorraine, and the Saar region, which is kind of loaded with a great deal of coal. That coal is going to be available to France, and so that's something that also is acquired. One note about some of this like weirdness here with like East Prussia and Germany and like Germany here, Poland had wanted to have access to the Baltic Sea and to a port. So Danzig is made a free port, so countries can access it. It is no longer a German space, but largely Germans live there. The same thing with some of the areas of Czechoslovakia are going to remain predominantly German, even though they'll become part of Czechoslovakia. Some areas of Poland will have Germanic peoples, even though they remain, part of, Poland, and Austria and Germany are, in the Treaty of Versailles, not allowed to create a unified state, even though there's Germanic people living in Austria. So it's like worth noting that when Hitler will start World War II in 1939, really before 1939, there is an Anschluss or a unification with Austria. There is the taking of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. There is eventually the start of World War II, when Germany attacks Poland. So all of this is not, without planning. All of these were lands that Germany lost during World War I. So some of the start of World War II is very connected to the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so I just kind of keep note of some of those. And then the last thing is we can see the new country of Turkey, and that becomes very notable. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire had lost a lot of land. The new country of Turkey gets created. Another aspect, so lots of, kind of things to note there. This is some of the land that gets ceded. So where you see the green, that's land that gets ceded by Germany. Some of the land that gets into this area here in between Germany and France will be a demilitarized zone. This does not become a buffer state, but does become by force demilitarized. And that's significant. Germany will lose Alsace and Lorraine and also some land on its eastern border. You can see all of the land that's ceded by Austria-Hungary in the yellow. And then you can see the French mandates in like this pinkish color where we see Syria and Lebanon, and then the British mandates as well. And that's the outgrowth of the Treaty of Sykes-Picot. And this is embedded also into League of Nations mandates that will be overseen by France and Great Britain. This is largely a euphemism for colonialism, okay? This will have a great deal of, issue, okay? This is the map, that kind of gives us a sense of some of the Middle East and Europe. The other thing that's a country that's not on the other map, so we're just going to note it here, is the country of Finland. Okay, so the country of Finland comes to be in the Treaty of Versailles, was not present in Europe, in 1915. Okay. So just kind of note that. And some of this is just, repeats of what we had already noted. Okay. This is the mandates, and we do see British and French control over oil resources. That is something that British and French really wanted access to. This is also going to create a great deal of tension. Lots of historians will look at the role of Britain in particular as a series of very mixed bag of promises. Britain had promised, we see in our discussion of Prince Faisal,